Hey everybody, welcome back to Truth Revealed. As always, I'm your host, Sergio Denaro. Just a little bit about me. I'm a former human intelligence collector with the military. I was trained through the Department of Defense, where I learned interrogation, source handling, debriefing, general human intelligence collection type stuff. If you want my whole bio, just look on my YouTube homepage. Today, we are going to be looking at Brian Albert. Finally, right? When I started my YouTube channel 3 months ago, I was looking at the Karen Reed case, and I've done quite a few of the witnesses up to this point. I've been waiting a little bit to do Brian Albert because I was trying to find that balance of how my videos could best reach the most number of people. And there's not a lot of people who do what I do. I wanted to try and find a way to show real deception detection in a way that's palatable. I tried making longer videos and I got a lot of comments that they were boring. I tried to make shorter videos and I got comments that too much was cut out. So starting with this video, I'm going to make them with the intent of creating a masterclass video and simultaneously releasing a highlight video that's going to be very condensed, as short as I can possibly make it. It's only going to have the very pertinent information. Now, if you're watching the highlight video and you want answers to questions, just watch the masterclass video. I will be happy to answer every question that people ask me on the masterclass video. On the highlight video, I'm not going to focus so heavily on answering comments if they're content related, because most of those questions will probably be answered in the long form. Now, I live my life by a couple of principles. Occam's razor, which is the simplest answer is usually the right answer. That's the very condensed version. That's not actually the razor, but that's generally what it means. And I found that that helps a lot when doing deception detection. If I have to take a lot of logical leaps in order to get to a certain conclusion, I'm probably in the middle of nowhere while I'm doing it. The answer that requires the least number of logical leaps is almost always the right answer. The second general rule is called Pareto's rule or Pareto's rule. Depends on what kind of accent you have. If you were to look at the amount of work that it takes in order to achieve a certain goal, and if you look at both of those things on a scale, then about 20% of the amount of work that it takes usually ends up with about 80% of the result. And the last 80% of work and effort that you put into something is how you achieve the last 20% of whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to learn how to play basketball, then if in your entire life you're going to spend 10,000 hours playing basketball, in the first 2,000 hours, you're going to learn 80% of the basketball skills, which makes sense because if you're starting at zero, you have to learn the rules, you have to learn general strategy, and you learn all that stuff very quickly. You have to learn how to dribble, the mechanics of how to shoot. Within 20% of the time, within 2,000 hours, you're going to have about 80% of the skill that you can possibly have. Over the last 8,000 hours of practice, you're going to refine that last 20% to get to the highest level that you can achieve. Now that works with sports, it works with everything. As far as I've found, maybe not literally everything, but I haven't found anything yet that general principle doesn't apply to. I pulled this up on ChatGPT. The examples that they give are 80% of a company's profits often come from 20% of its customers or products. Time management, 20% of your activities may generate 80% of your productive results. That's the general rule itself. In sales, 80% of sales come from 20% of clients. That's just a bunch of examples. In an ideal economy, you want the top 20% of the wealthy people in the country to have 80% of the wealth in the country. And you want the bottom 80% of people to have 20% of the wealth in the country. I learned that in business school. Just generally, everything seems to work best that way. Let's say the amount of time that it takes me to analyze a witness testimony statement, it depends on how long the person was on the stand. Let's say they were on the stand for 1 hour, and let's say that it would take me 5 hours, and this is pretty accurate. It takes me about 5 hours to analyze about 1 hour worth of testimony, of question and answer going back and forth. That's for me to do a complete job. So what I've been doing up to this point, instead of taking 5 hours to look at a statement, I've been applying all of the general rules and principles that I use to do analysis. But I've been doing it in about 1 hour. And I'm gathering about 80% of the information that I could gather from looking at the statement. That gives me 100% clarity on whether the person who's talking generally did what they are accused of or not. If you've watched my other videos, you know that sometimes I'm showing you an innocent person who's on trial, and there are other people that I've been showing you who are on the stand and they are guilty. I'm showing you deception and I'm showing you truth. However, if you're having difficulty up to this point really believing that the end result of what I'm doing is 100% accurate. It's because I haven't been showing you all of the work that I've been doing up to this point. And it's curtailed, and I could do a lot more. The reason I haven't been doing a lot more is because I feel like people just generally aren't interested in the minute detail. All of that is changing now. At this point, my masterclass is going to have all the detail. I've already done the 5 hours of analysis for the first hour of testimony for Brian Albert, and we're going to go through that today. I don't know how long this video is going to be, probably about an hour. I might drop the video in 2 segments and then do the next hour of his testimony. But the masterclass is going to be everything. If you're interested in knowing exactly how I do what I do, you're going to see that. And I'm going to pull 100% of the information for you, and we're going to put everything together. We're going to dive in here and we're going to tear this apart. So if I haven't made it clear up to this point, the masterclass version of my videos is going to go into great detail. So you will get to see my full brain on display here. You're not going to get an edited version of it. Generally, most people get bored when I do that. So that's why I hesitated from doing the entire analysis on video before. But here we are. Now, remember, if you've already seen my videos and you just want the highlights on this one, watch the highlight video. You're only going to miss the details. You're not going to miss the outcome. I'm not going to miss any of the good stuff, like the juicy stuff, the answers that look like an entire rainbow threw up all over it. For this masterclass, I will be heavily emphasizing baselining. That's the one thing that I have skipped over the most up to this point. Of all the stuff that I'm editing out of the videos in order to make them a reasonable amount of time, baselining is probably the greatest casualty. And I figured that it was probably the least interesting to you. However, I'm finding that a lot of people don't believe what I'm saying because there are differences sometimes. For example, when some people repeat I once, so they say I, for some people that is definitive deception. For other people, it means mild sensitivity. And for others, it means great sensitivity, but not necessarily deception. So why do I have all these rules, and why do these rules change? Well, it depends on the person's baseline. I start by going through the entire statement and finding out, how do people use repeated words? For example, do people repeat words as a way of formulating a coherent sentence, or do they use repeating words as a way of fabricating? There are multiple potential uses for repeated words, which could be trying to think through your answer, or it could be trying to create a completely new answer. I have been doing all of this stuff in the background, and then I just tell you as I'm going through it, a repeated I, that means deception. And that can make it difficult for you to apply these rules later if you don't see how I baseline the person. So we are going to go through all of the mundane questions in the beginning so that you can get a full understanding of not just Brian Albert's baseline, but how to baseline people, because that is by far the most important part of this. Once you understand someone's baseline, you will understand where they're deceptive. You will understand how to tailor the words that you choose while you're interrogating them. And I'm not talking about necessarily an interrogator in an interrogation booth. If your significant other, if you think they're cheating on you, if you sit down and start asking them questions, you are interrogating them. And I want to give you the right information here so that you can conduct your own interrogations in your own personal life and get the truth. So the most important part is to baseline somebody. Even if you've been living with somebody for 15 years, you are probably going to need to baseline them before you start talking to them, because you may not have actually ever talked to them before with the intention of generating their baseline. Let's go ahead and get started. So in red, we have the question itself. All of these are going to be from ADA Lally. In black, I have the answer to the question. That is going to be from Brian Albert. In purple, I have my notes. Sometimes I hide my notes from you. Sometimes I show them. It just depends. If I think seeing my notes will help you to understand what I'm saying, I'll put them up there. If I have extra content that I want you to focus on what I'm saying rather than the notes, then sometimes I cut them off. Just be aware I'm doing that because I want you to focus on the example that I'm actually talking about. Question 1, where do you live? And Brian Albert says, I live in Norwood, Massachusetts. All right, good use of I, correct tense. He answers the question directly. There's no extra information before or after the answer. Let's see if this continues. We need at least 10 questions in order to get a general baseline. and probably 30 questions to get a good baseline. How long have you lived in Norwood? Approximately a year. So we've lost the I. He drops the I here. Approximately a year. We know that these answers are truthful. This is the beginning. This is common knowledge questions where everybody knows the answer so that you can see what somebody looks like when they're telling you the truth. So we know that he can drop the I. Now we want to try and figure out really quickly why he did that. And the first thing that I notice is this is a where do you live and how long have you lived there? So this is the same topic, same subject, and he's shortening the answers because we all know what the topic is, and so the answers get shorter. Now, that tells us that brevity is important to him. He doesn't overspeak. Still no extra information in the beginning or the end, and that gets a little bit shorter. Kind of the same way when you introduce a new person, you get their full title, you get who they are and their full title. And then the second time that you refer to somebody, you get a shortening of that title to what you call them or what that person calls them. So no use of I when the topic doesn't change. That's just a note. We want to see if that continues. Who do you live in Norwood with? So a third question about Norwood. And he says, my wife, Nicole, and my son, Brian, and my son, Brandon. All right, the no I still holds true here. He doesn't repeat the question here. He doesn't say, I live in Norwood with. He just gives the answer. And we get a proper introduction for Nicole, my wife, Nicole. That is generally a proper introduction. My is the correct possessive pronoun. That means that at this point, we don't see any conflict with her. Then he says, my son, Brian. So that's good. That means he's introducing all of his family members the same way. And my son, Brandon. So we have a good direct answer to this question. No superfluous information at all. Your wife, Nicole, how long have the two of you been married? And he says approximately 29 years. We see approximately again when he's giving you information that is approximate. He's using the right word. It's not exactly, so he doesn't tell you that it's exactly. He doesn't say 29 years. Some people would just say 29 years. That tells you whether they count by anniversaries or whether they are more precise in their language. So we now know that Brian Albert is pretty precise. He is precise and concise.
Actually, just a little bit about your family as far as, let me start with yourself and your wife, Nicole. How long have the two of you been married?
Approximately 29 years.
Concise. Okay, first, let me tell you that the way that ADA Lally asks questions is horrifying. For example, do you have any siblings? I cut that question all the way down to the bare basics. So that probably started with 20 words, and I cut out all of the words that are not the question themselves. I don't change the language for the responses by Brian Albert. Those are exact, including if I hear sounds in between words, I'll add those in. But when it comes to the question itself, what's important to us is what question is Brian Albert answering. So it just makes it easier for me to read and for you to understand. If I were to read every word that Lally says, it would take days just to get through his ums and ahs and crazy words. So sometimes you'll see like this, were you together for a period of time prior to get married? That should be getting, but that's because the way he phrased that had so many words in there that get was correct when this had 50 words in it. So back to the questions here. Yes, we've known each other since we were 13, 14 years old. Okay, great. He answers the question first. This is a full answer to the question. But now he knows that most people are going to want a little bit more information there. So he adds on, we've, a contraction for we have. We've known each other since we were 13, 14 years old. Now, technically, we have a since right here. So this is an explanatory statement. And we want to notate that and try and figure out what does the explanatory statement for Brian Albert mean. Here, we determined that he answered the question right here. Were you together for a period of time prior to getting married? The answer to the question is yes. But because he phrases it as a period of time, were you together for a period of time? He wants more information than a yes or no answer in the question. And Brian Albert understands that, as we all do. When we hear somebody ask a question, we can tell if they're trying to get more than a yes or no answer. So he says, we've known each other since we were 13, 14 years old. So he doesn't know exactly. That's basically like approximately, but it's too hard to do the math. From whatever age he is, minus 13 or 14 years would give you approximately 40 years or whatever. They've known each other for a long time. So the easiest way for him to tell you this is we've known each other, and then since is an explanatory. He is explaining this to you. So That makes this make sense. You should see an explanatory word before an explanation. And if the explanation is something that was asked for in the question, so period of time, then you would expect to see the explanatory statement there. And because he says, since we were 13, 14 years old, all of this is a perfect answer. This is exactly what he was being asked. There's no extra information. We have the right pronoun. We have a change of topics, so we have pronouns here. You see we twice. This is a good answer to this question, and this is a completely normal baseline up to this point. Do you have siblings? And he says, I do. This is a very high commitment statement. He could have said yes. This is a yes or no question, but he chooses not to say yes. He chooses to say, I do, which, like I said, that is a high commitment way of speaking. One thing that a lot of people are not used to is assigning a level of commitment to the words that they hear. Yes is a mid-level commitment, which means when it's used as one word only, it can be used as deception. To make up an entire sentence, it makes your stress live out over an extended period of time. So it's better to just end your stress quickly and say yes. That's why yes is not a high commitment statement. If he says, I do, the chances of him lying when he says I do is very slim because he's putting a level of commitment that is higher than the word yes on this. All right. I know I'm beating this dead horse, but this is a masterclass in baselining. Keep that in mind. So yes is not strong enough when referring to his family here. So he has a very high commitment. How many siblings do you have? He says, I have 5 brothers and 1 sister. He gives you a very precise and concise answer with a pronoun here. Are you the oldest? Random question. But he says, I'm the oldest of 7. Yes. The way this is phrased, if he just says yes to him, that's not enough commitment. But this is very much a yes or no. You can't say I do after are you the oldest. So he says, I'm the oldest of 7. Yes. Now, the one thing that we will just notate is he puts the yes at the end of his answer. So he gives you the extra information first, which he didn't do up here. He says, yes, we've known each other since we were 13, 14. That means that he is comfortable doing either one because we know that these are truthful answers. So it doesn't matter to me now if I see the answer come at the end as opposed to at the beginning. For him, that's normal. Prior to living at your address in Norwood, where did you live? And he says, Canton. And then he says, Canton, Massachusetts. Okay, because we're baselining here, we have 2 things that are interesting. We have the missing pronoun. He does not say, I live in Canton. He just gives a one-word answer, Canton. That does seem odd because it makes it feel like it's sensitive. Prior to living at your address in Norwood, where did you live? Everybody knows where he lived. He lived at the house where John O'Keefe was murdered. We know this is a truthful answer, but he doesn't say 34 Fairview, which is how most people refer to his house. He says Canton, and then he realizes that's not enough information, and then he repeats it and says Canton, Massachusetts, Canton, Mass. So this feels sensitive. We are still in the baseline period, but we know with certainty that that residence is sensitive for him. A dead body was found on his lawn. It can't not be sensitive. So we would expect to see some sensitivity here. And what we're seeing is that sensitivity manifests itself in a shorter answer and then a little bit of an explanation here. So that doesn't tell us anything definitive at this point, but it's another note that we're going to make here. Then the question is how long? And he says approximately, and then he says in the house on Fairview Road, approximately 11 years. So this is not a direct answer here. He starts to answer the question, which is normal for him, approximately, and then he should have just said approximately 11 years. But he has realized that he didn't give enough information in the answer to the question above. So now he decides to insert that information into the middle, in the house on Fairview Road. That is adding more specificity to a question that he overgeneralized before. In total, about how long have you been a resident of Canton, Massachusetts, is what he's saying. And he says approximately 45 years. Now we switch back to a question that's not sensitive. We expect sensitivity on the house, but we don't expect any sensitivity on how long have you been a resident of Canton, Massachusetts. And he says approximately 45 years, exactly the same way that he answered this question up here, approximately 29 years, approximately a year. So He is very consistent with the way that he answers questions. This is not unexpected for somebody who's been in law enforcement. I would expect their answers to be concise and precise, exactly how they are here. He says, that's 34 Fairview Road. Is that right? And now we get a yes with no further explanation or increased level of commitment here, because we're back to a house that we know was sensitive. Obviously, he has a bad association to the house. We know that with certainty. He uses the word yes, the low commitment version, with nothing attached to it. So we call it a one-word answer. So you'll see me abbreviate it as a one-word answer. And we know that a one-word answer here means he's feeling sensitive here. He was feeling sensitive up here, and he made his answer too short. And now we have, again, that sensitivity, and we see the sensitivity come out in his answer. What relationship did your family have to that home before you, your wife, and your kids moved? And he says, my parents had lived at that residence prior to us. Again, this is too short because the question is, what relationship did that home have to you and your family? And he really avoids talking about the relationship that he has to the home. He even decides to define the term family in his mind as not his wife and kids. If somebody asks me, what tie do you and your family have to your home? I'm immediately going to think me, my wife, and my kids. What tie do my kids have to the home? It's the only home they've ever known. They're the ones with ties to it. So he actually cuts all of that out and says, only my parents had lived at that residence prior to us. Before we take a peek into his brain, we want to first look at the indicators. And he uses the word that here, that residence. The word that is an indicator of distance. Remember, this indicates closeness. That indicates distance. That is not a deception detection thing. That's by the literal definitions of the words. But by paying attention to that, that will tell you in a case like this right here, he has distanced himself from that residence, both mentally and physically. My parents had lived at that residence prior to us. It's very impersonal, this answer. And so it's interesting. He has distanced himself from the residence, which we've seen from his answer of yes here. We've seen from including that in his answer here and the question above that. So you had spent some of your childhood in that house as well. He actually disassociated himself so much from the question of the relationship that he has to the home that Lally has to rephrase the question. So you had spent some of your childhood in that house as well. And he says, yes, because the question includes verbiage about his childhood, the answer needs to or should, by social norms, should include some information about how long he was there, his personal feelings. The question is trying to access that part of his brain that's recalling his childhood. He says, you spent some of your childhood in that house as well. The answer is yes. Now we are starting to see a pattern that is a good enough pattern for us that we can start to make some definitive statements about his baseline. So the short answer here could indicate sensitivity around why he uprooted from the house that he has strong ties to. There's no question that he has strong ties to that house. His parents had the house. He grew up in the house. Once his parents passed away, he kept the house. He has raised his family in the house that he grew up in. I believe that seems like what he's saying here. So this one word answer of yes here is very sensitive. That means I don't want to talk about my childhood. Whenever people cut that answer down to a one-word answer, it means we're done talking about this. I have nothing left to tell you about this subject. Now we're seeing huge sensitivity. That tells us that not only that he's sensitive about the house, but when he is sensitive about a topic, he uses one-word answers, yes or no. That is something that will be meaningful as we look at other questions later. That's why these questions are here. Do you work? He says, I do, retired now, retired. Let's try and stay in his head here. I do is a very high commitment statement. Now, he's retired. He doesn't actually work. But when you put a high commitment statement like that, I do, it means he has personal pride and a love of the work that he did. I do. That's at the level of his family. That is not a yes. Do you work is a yes or no question. He says, I do. And then he sort of remembers that he's retired. Technically, he doesn't work anymore. So the answer isn't correct. And it's not a lie. He immediately fixes it. He's not trying to deceive you here. He is showing you a sense of pride in this first I do. And then he says, I do, retired now, retired. So he corrects it. And so we see if he gives you an answer that's imprecise, he will correct it immediately. and very accurately. And we also know that he did love his own. Let's keep going. What did you retire from? And he says, the Boston Police Department. That's a short answer. Is it problematic? You might expect somebody to give their position, like I retired as a sergeant from the Boston Police Department or something along those lines. But someone who has worked their entire career in a profession, they may not have a short answer for that. Okay, are you asking me for a 3-paragraph answer, or is this an intro question that we just need to get through? If I decide that you're just asking me a simple question, then I'm going to cut that question off in the very beginning and just answer the question without any extra information, which is exactly what he does here. He says, the Boston Police Department, no extra information. Technically, you didn't ask for any extra information in here, so there's nothing problematic about this. How long were you a member of the Boston Police Department? And he says approximately 30 years. Again, the 4th time now that he has used this approach. He says approximately and gives you a number. So again, very good baseline that we're getting here. Within the Boston Police Department, were you assigned to any sort of specific unit? Now, this is another thing about being on the witness stand. Brian Albert, like everybody who's on the witness stand, has to make a decision. How much information are you really asking for? How much of an elaboration do you really want when you're answering a question truthfully? And you don't need to stress about it, because you're going to answer the question, Boston Police Department, and if they want more information, they'll ask for it. So you don't have to feel bad. Some people feel bad if they don't give you enough information. You don't have to feel bad about not giving information. And people who are on the witness stand, they may over-explain themselves a little bit in the beginning and then realize a little bit as they get into it that they don't have to over-explain. The questions will keep coming. But Brian Albert has a lot of experience with seeing people on the stand and the judicial system. So he knows right from the beginning. He'll just answer the question simply, and if they want more information, they'll ask for it. Within the Boston Police Department, were you assigned to any sort of specific unit? He says, my last assignment, is that what you're referring to? Now, when some people do this, they're being obstinate. They're being difficult. So we want to ask ourselves, is Brian Albert beginning to be difficult here? But the other thing we got to ask ourselves is this a logical answer? Is this something that you might say? If you've been working a career where you constantly change assignments, police officers are a little bit different than other jobs. Let's say desk jobs, where you get a promotion and your job is different. So you have a different title. Now you're a manager, then you're a director. When somebody says, I retired as the director of such and such, that's a pretty complete answer. The Boston Police Fugitive Unit is not necessarily a promotion above others. It's a detail that you have to apply to and be accepted into. But there are other details, the violent crime unit, there's a lot of units. So he's probably worked in a lot of different units. And when he gets the question, were you assigned to any sort of specific unit? He's probably thinking, yeah, I've been assigned to 15 different specific units. So asking the question, my last assignment, is that what you're referring to, is actually a good question. He's not being obstinate or difficult here. Lally says yes. And then he says, yes, my last assignment was the Boston Police Fugitive Unit. So Brian Albert, if he's not 100% sure, he will ask a good question, a concise, direct question, and then give a direct answer. He says yes, gives the full answer up front, yes, and then the extra information that he was looking for, which was, my last assignment was the Boston Police Fugitive Unit. Okay. If I could turn your attention to January 28th, do you recall that date? All right. Now we're getting into sensitive questions here. Now we've got our baseline, as much of it as we can get up to this point. And we're going to start getting into questions that might deviate from this. So if I could turn your attention, do you recall that date? He says yes. Ooh, good. This is right in line with his baseline so far. January 28th is a sensitive date. His residence is a sensitive residence. He does not want to elaborate on everything that happened. He's just going to let you ask questions. This is a sensitive answer to a question that is in reference to a sensitive time. And so one word answer. And do you recall that day of the week, what it was? He says the 28th, I believe, was a Friday. If you were to ask me what the 28th of January was 2 years ago, without looking at a calendar, I couldn't tell you what day of the week it was. Even when something major happens, this is something that I'm sure he had to look up beforehand. He probably looked at a calendar and, okay, I believe it was a Friday. If I looked at the calendar right, this is a good answer to that question. It's direct, but he does use I believe. So that means when he went and looked at the calendar, he's assuming that he looked at the calendar correctly. I believe is how do I say this? There are varying degrees of minimizing commitment to your statement. I believe is probably the highest commitment level that you can have in a reduction of commitment statement. So most of the time, you're going to get the truth after that. When you see I believe, it's not usually used as an indicator of deception. It's usually used as an indicator of truthfulness, that they may not be 100% certain, meaning he's not pulling this from his memory. He's pulling it from a calendar that he looked at. So this isn't actually part of what his brain stored as a memory of that day. Okay, when you first got up on the 28th, where were you at that point? And he says, on the 28th, I was in New York City. It's hard to tell if the repetition here is New York State, New York City, or if he's actually repeating New York. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here because it's possible that somebody might say I was in New York, meaning the state, which means they could have been in a different city other than New York City. So when he says on the 28th, I was in New York City, because he very intentionally makes the second part of this more specific in a way that you and I can recognize as a detail that could be needed here, that I don't consider this to be word repetition. Word repetition is an indicator. So I don't think that this is an indicator at this point. Lally says, why had you gone to New York? He says, so we have not seen this to this point. Beginning an answer with an explanatory statement is a big indicator. Seeing the word so here is very sensitive. It's not something he's ever done before. Why had you gone to New York? That is a very direct question. And the answer should not be sensitive. At this point, Lally doesn't even expect anything to be sensitive. He is literally just trying to set the stage. So for you to see sensitivity here, this is odd. And it's something that we do not want to dismiss. Notice I uncontracted do not want to dismiss, because I want to emphasize that point. He says, so I went to New York for a funeral. Really? Now we have a repeated word that there's no reason to repeat this word. This is a repeated word. The indicator. It's a repeated word indicator. New York for a funeral of a New York City police officer who was killed in the line of duty. The fact that there's no indicators in here doesn't really tell us that this is a truthful statement, because we have indicators. We have two indicators here, which means that this could be rehearsed. Is this how you would rehearse it? Is this a phrase that you would rehearse like this? We went to the funeral of a New York City police officer who was killed in the line of duty. Actually, yeah, that's how you would rehearse that, which means I can't give any credibility to this just because there's no indicator in here. So we do need to pay attention to this. This is wrong. This is not by his baseline. So the first question where the answer isn't known and we see an X, which is an explanatory statement, as the first word. That's interesting. You don't see that very often. So we're going to notate that. Later, we will see that this indicates high sensitivity and deception. So now I have to toe this line with you, right? I've already gone through this entire statement and I know what I see repeated. Because you're going to go through the entire statement and you're going to see every single time this is repeated, I'm just going to tell you up front, there's information that I have now that you're not going to have until the very end. Now, we could either go through this and I could say, just watch for this later. And then basically, by the time you get to the end of this video, you're going to have to turn around and watch the entire thing again so that you see this first incident of so when we weren't sure what exactly this means yet. And then you're going to look at this and say, that means he didn't go to New York for the funeral. Is what he's telling you here. This is deceptive. You are going to get evidence of this because it's a reoccurring thing, not simply because I saw this once. There are very few definitive that every single time you see one particular indicator, it means deception. What means deception is seeing multiple indicators together. The statement has to scream deception, and you want to see a pattern. So here we have two indicators. We have a repeated word and we have an explanatory as the first word in the statement. He went to New York for a different reason. That we will know by the end of this. Okay, what day did you go down to New York? So he says, we went down. Definitely, there was more than just him. We went down the day before. So I believe that was Thursday. Okay, that's interesting because when he was asked what day of the week was the 28th, he says, the 28th, I believe, was a Friday. So I would expect to see his truthful answer to be something like, I believe, like, what day did you go down there? I believe that was the 27th, or I believe that was Thursday. Either one of those answers would have been in line with his baseline. This is not. So he says, we went down the day before. Before is a missing time indicator. So we know that this means before something. He is insinuating the funeral, but he doesn't say it. That means I can tell you definitively that he went down before something, but I absolutely cannot tell you that that was before the funeral. I would expect to see the word funeral here. He just literally cuts himself off in the middle of the sentence, which means it's highly likely, it's highly probable that he went down before something else. He could have still traveled on Thursday, but he went down the day before the real reason why he went there. That's literally the only thing that this tells you. So I believe that was Thursday. Okay, this would have been the truthful answer. He could have said, I believe that was Thursday. What day did you go down to New York? This is actually a complete answer to that question. There's no reason to have the rest of this in here. And because we know that he speaks concise and with precision, none of these words should be here because they are there. And because we have an explanatory statement, we have missing time, and we have a sentence fragment. Now, this might be technically a sentence, but it's actually a fragment in his mind because he doesn't tell you before what. I'm willing to say definitively here that these indicators mean that he went down for a different reason than the funeral. It doesn't necessarily mean it's nefarious. He might have went down to buy a gift for his wife. Yeah, I mean, who knows? But whatever the real reason is, he's not telling you. So we have the break right here. This is what we want to be aware of. All right, let's move on. How it was that you got down there. It's the most sense I can make out of what he said. He says, yes. So in all of these other words, there was something about, did he go down there, how he got down there. So he says, yes, I flew to New York. This is a repeating phrase, and he's also repeating the word I in the repeating phrase. So we have repetition of I and repetition of flew. This is an indicator. This means whatever he just said here is sensitive. It has meaning to him other than the meaning that he is portraying to you. He says, I flew to New York. He did not fly by himself. He flew with other people. He says, we went down there before. So we don't know who they are, but we know that there was more than just him. Who, if anyone, went with you on the trip to New York? He says, because he says we earlier. He says, I flew with a friend and a coworker named Eddie Hernandez. We have I flew, we have with. With is an indicator of conflict. So whoever he's about to say he flew with, he had conflict with. And then he says a friend. By not saying my, by using a non-possessive pronoun, that is another indicator of conflict. So Brian Albert definitely has conflict with the friend, which is Eddie Hernandez. Let's get Eddie marked here. Eddie Hernandez. So we know that there's conflict with Eddie. He says he flew with a friend and a coworker. So this is weird. We don't know whether he flew with two people. One was a friend and one was a coworker. Because he says Eddie Hernandez, most people would say a friend and coworker, but he says a friend and a coworker. So there's something deceptive about this. He is insinuating that there's three people, but he's only telling you that there's one person, Eddie, and he is telling you that he has conflict with Eddie. That's all we know at this point. So in New York at the funeral, were there other members of law enforcement that you were familiar with? He says, yes, there were thousands of police officers that went to the funeral. Interesting. This is not a direct answer to that question. That is outside of Brian Albert's baseline. Now, that tells me that there's other people there that he doesn't want you to know about. So there's people there that he was either doing stuff with that he's hiding, so he doesn't want to say their names directly, or that he has conflict with them. So this is very sensitive. When somebody answers the question by not answering the question, that's very sensitive. He says there were thousands. Instead of saying the person that he was familiar with, because the question is implying that he wants names here. Were there other members of law enforcement that you were familiar with? And he not only doesn't give you names, but shotguns out, makes this broad statement. There were thousands of police officers there. He's only answering this part of the question. Were there other members of law enforcement there? And so, very sensitive. Included within those people mentioned, now Lally has to get the information that he was asking to begin with. Included within those people mentioned, you have a brother, Kevin, is that correct? And he says, yes. Well, now we got a one-word answer, and Kevin is a family member, so we would expect a higher level of commitment than just the word yes. There's a problem with Kevin here. Now, is the problem conflict with Kevin? That was my first thought, but we have to think through this because the only thing that we know with absolute certainty is that there's sensitivity around Kevin. We don't know that he has conflict. We didn't see any other indicators. He doesn't use with. He didn't use a non-possessive pronoun. He did leave Kevin out up here, so we don't know how Kevin got there. Kevin is his brother. So how did Kevin get there? If he flew with Kevin, and didn't mention that up here, there's something that he doesn't want you to know about Kevin. Is he leaving Kevin out because he doesn't want to drag Kevin into this? If he shows later that he has a good relationship with Kevin, I go back to this question and say, okay, if he has a good relationship with Kevin, then we can be pretty certain that Kevin has information that Brian Albert doesn't want police to ask Kevin because of this trip, or he just simply doesn't want to drag another one of his family members into this whole ordeal, which is possible. But if he has a bad relationship with Kevin later, then we know that this here is because he has a bad relationship with Kevin. This yes, right here. So we're just going to keep all of that in mind. Is he a police officer as well? He is. So he doesn't say yes. Yes would be sensitivity around that. And Brian Albert is not sensitive about that. Okay, where is he? He's a detective in Canton, Massachusetts. Okay, so family member, direct, this is his baseline here, so we're good with this. Was he down at the funeral as well? He was. Okay, that's a direct answer to the question, but we are not getting the answer to the implied question, which is, did he go with you? But Lally didn't ask that question. And so garbage in, garbage out. If you don't ask the question, I can't definitively say here that Brian Albert's hiding it. He could simply just not be picking up what Lally's putting down. So you know a gentleman by the name of Brian Higgins. So Lally, instead of asking the question, did he fly with you? Did he go there with you? Which would have been important because it means that he left that out of the stuff above. He moves on. So we have to move on. Let's see. You know a gentleman by the name of Brian Higgins? Yes. Yes is a word that means sensitivity to Brian Albert. So there's no I do this time. Brian Higgins is not on the level of family. Not only is he not on the level of family, there's sensitivity there. So we want to keep that in mind as we keep going here. How is it that you know Brian Higgins? And he says, so interesting. We know immediately there's sensitivity here. How do you know Brian Higgins? So I know Brian Higgins initially from work, a professional relationship. I've known him for, or known of him for 10 or 15 years. Okay, this is a much broader span of time than he was giving before. It's not necessarily deceptive, but he says he's known him or known of him. So he's probably known him for closer to 10 years and known of him for closer to 15. And then the past few years, more recently, we worked together. Okay, it's an indicator of closeness here. We worked together on a closer basis. Working together on a closer basis, there's sensitivity to that. So them working together is something that is creating sensitivity here on a closer basis. And I became better friends with him. This is a problem. Can you see the problem here? He says with. With is a big indicator of conflict. I is separated as far as he can get I in that sentence away from himself. Brian Albert says, we worked together on a closer basis and I became better friends with him. So this sensitivity is likely due to this conflict and I became better friends with him. Now I am going to say, I don't believe you. This is deception. We have one indicator here. We have two indicators of conflict that go along with that. And because the words that he's saying is that they became better friends, they didn't become better friends. They were working together, but Brian Albert's opinion of Brian Higgins went down over the last 3 years, not up. So that is what I'm getting from his indicators and sensitivity here. So this starts with an explanatory statement. We want to remember that. That means there's going to be a lie in here, and we found the lie. It's right at the end here. Repeating AA, which leads into the rest of this. I and him separated. Note, it was we. Oh yeah, it was we right here before they started working together. Then we worked together on a closer basis, and I became better friends with him. This tells you very specifically and very clearly that he considered him a friend until they started working together. And then when they started working together on a closer basis, that friendship went downhill. And then Lally says, fair to say that when he became better friends with you, you also sort of socialized with him outside of work? And Brian says, yes. Sensitive. It's too short. It's a sensitive answer here. This answer's too short for baseline. However, we know this because Brian Albert doesn't like Brian Higgins, so this checks out. And we can see that this ties directly to this question here. Do you begin to socialize with him? Technically, yes, but he didn't necessarily want to socialize with him more, but he did. Your return trip from New York, what, if anything, happened? Now, it's a vague question that I honestly wouldn't know how to answer this. What, if anything, happened? So he says, on the return trip from New York, we drove back. I would like to say that he's evading the question here, but technically the question, it's so meaningless that an answer that's this meaningless, he says on the return trip from New York, but it's basically on the drive back from New York, we drove back. That's what he's saying. And it's honestly the answer is just as stupid as the question. So he's probably leaving information out here, but we get no indicators here because of how bad the question was. So we just ignore it. Why did you drive versus fly back? Oh, well, if that's what you meant, why didn't you ask that the first time? Let's see if we get a better answer here. Yep, we know right off the bat we're going to get a better answer here. So that weekend, we have distance, okay? That weekend, there was anticipated snowstorm. Oof, okay. So we have something about the snowstorm or something coming up from the snowstorm is sensitive to him. And I believe, okay, this generally is going to check out the flight that, okay, now we have another distancing indicator that we were taking with JetBlue. So this is stumbling on a word, but that's interesting because JetBlue, the only way to stumble on that is if your mind is completely somewhere else. He has to be thinking hard about the end of this sentence in order to misenunciate JetBlue. So this is an indicator of sensitivity, not in this answer, not in the fact that it's JetBlue, but in the fact that his mind is occupied. So we have two indicators that his mind is occupied here. He says, I believe that the flight that we were taking with JetBlue may have been canceled. He starts with a reduction of commitment that is usually a good reduction, but then he changes it to may. May is the absolute opposite of believe. I'm going to throw out random numbers here. This is something that I don't have statistics on, but let's say that 90% of the time that you say believe, you're telling the truth, then 90% of the time you say may, you're actually being deceptive. We have, I believe the flight may have been canceled and Brian Higgins was leaving. Okay, let's talk about this first. May have been canceled. Because he uses both of these indicators in here, but may is the one that he uses right before it. He might have assumed that it was canceled, but that's not the reason why he drove back with Brian Higgins. By saying may, he's saying that he doesn't know. He doesn't have any firsthand knowledge of whether the flight was canceled or not. He didn't check it. So he drove back and he says, and Brian Higgins, that's the first time he mentions Brian Higgins, and he gives the full name, which is not uncommon in court. But he doesn't give any extra identifiers, not ATF agent Brian Higgins. Let's see. Brian Higgins was leaving. All right, we know leaving's a problem. In a vehicle that morning. Okay, that morning, that's interesting because we don't know when the funeral was. But if he left the morning of the funeral, I'm not sure how you could go to the funeral if you actually left in the morning. Most of the time, if the funeral's in the morning, somebody would either say that he was leaving right after the funeral or he was leaving in the afternoon, something like that. He says he was leaving in the morning. Morning typically means technically it's going to be any time before noon, but most people don't use the word morning if they're talking about around noon. Mornings usually ends at about 10 o'clock, McDonald's style. And keep in mind, I'm old, so I mean McDonald's from the 1980s. I don't know what time they're open now for breakfast. So he says that Brian Higgins left in the morning. So we ended up driving, or after the funeral, we ended up driving with him. We have a bunch of problems here. We have an explanatory statement. We have a missing time. We ended up driving. And then he says, or. So, or in order to fix what you just said, if you said something incorrect, is not the right word there. You'd normally say, I mean. You'd say, so we ended up driving. I mean, after the funeral, we ended up driving. But he says, or. So this is odd. So we ended up driving. There's missing time here. A funeral is one of those activities that you gloss over. There's going to church, there's going to a movie, there's watching the big game. Those are things that you should see the word after. So the word after here is missing time, and that missing time is the funeral. These marry up, and this is not a problem. This is not missing time meaning an indicator of something. The ended up is problematic, though. He says, so we ended up driving, or after the funeral, we ended up driving with him. This tells me that they left in the morning, and then he's thinking, I told them that I went to the funeral. So we ended up driving, or after the funeral, we ended up driving. But ended up means that there's some sort of incident here. There's a timeline where they got up in the morning, something happened, there's an incident that is missing time, and then ended up driving. in the morning. I'm willing to say at this point they didn't go to the funeral. The fact that this is an afterthought that he tries to fix and doesn't fix correctly is very problematic. And then ended up, if the reason that they went back was because of the snowstorm, he would have said, because of the snowstorm, we ended up. Then the snowstorm would be tied to ending up. Or if he just said, because of the snowstorm, we drove back early, then that would have been okay. But he doesn't. He only says we ended up, which means we have definitely a missing incident here. There is something that happened before they drove back. And then he says we ended up driving back with him. So we have an indicator of conflict with Brian Higgins. And we expect to see the with because we already know that Brian Albert does not particularly like Brian Higgins, but this conflict here could have been due to the missing incident here. This could be something as simple as we were intending on going back. Our flight wasn't until, let's say, 6 p.m. And we were expecting the snowstorm to get so bad that I was expecting that my flight would probably be canceled by that point. So I asked Brian Higgins if we could drive back with him after the funeral. And he said, sure. So we all drove back together. That is how a normal person would give you the chain of events. But that's not what we got here. So we know that there was some incident, and it probably included Brian Higgins not wanting to drive them back. And that's all we really get from this. So who knows what happened? Maybe Brian Higgins stayed up drinking all night, going to clubs, who knows, whatever, didn't go to the funeral and was just going to drive back in the morning and didn't want to explain all that, why he wasn't going to the funeral. We don't know what the truth is here, but we do know that this story is not the truth. Okay, it's possible that Brian Higgins didn't want to wait until after the funeral. It's possible that Brian Albert was saying, hey, after the funeral, let's all drive back together. And Brian Higgins was like, I have no intention of waiting until after the funeral. And that could be what caused this whole thing here.